You know what that was a clip from? Obviously, kind of Fistful of Dollars, but also
What is it? I don't know.
Back to the Future Part 2.
Part 2 or Part 3?
It's Part 2, which is kind of a teaser of what Part 3 is going to become, right?
Which is like, I was going to say, Part 3 was maybe one of the first Western films I've ever seen.
Yeah, I think that's probably true for a lot of Americans.
Yeah. When did that come out? The third one? Like the 90s sometime?
90, yeah, like 1990.
Yeah.
In that scene, it's a future Biff in the hot tub with a couple ladies.
Oh, yeah. No, I just watched the second one. I should have gotten it. I just watched it like a month ago because of Trump stuff. I'm like, well,
sure. I love that in the future, they're still watching movies on square tube TVs.
Yeah, of course. Some things never change. Welcome to Film Trace, folks. This is a podcast where we trace the life of a film from conception to production, all the way to release and reception. It is season 15. We're doing Visionary Remakes this season. We are to the 1960s. We're doing A Fistful of Dollars from 1964. And then that was a remake of Yojimbo from 1961. I guess can we call it a remake? It's kind of like a copy. I don't even know what you want to call it. I guess it is a traditional remake, kind of stolen to some degree.
Illegal remake.
Yeah, an unauthorized reimagining of Yojimbo.
There you go.
And so this is the second. I guess both of these would qualify as Westerns. But this is the second Western set we've had. We did True Grit in the 2010s. That was a fun episode. True Grit from 1969 and from 2010. And as a self-avowed person who doesn't have a huge background on Westerns, doesn't really sort of get them or love them all that much, this has been a stretch for me this season to kind of sort of like dive into these two movies. But I will have to say, A Fistful of Dollars and Yojimbo are both, like, I would say, comparing it especially to True Grit, which also came out in the 60s, completely different animals.
Yes.
And it is bizarre to me, looking back at True Grit 1969, that has any stature whatsoever, because it's so out of place in terms of like what was going on throughout the world in cinema and filmmaking in terms of Westerns in the 1960s. It just seems like it's from, it's 15 years too late. What's your history with both of these movies? Have you seen them before, or is this kind of a first time?
Yeah, these are a couple movies that I had never found myself drawn to, even though I saw both of them back in the day. As I kind of mentioned on the True Grit episode, Westerns was kind of my jam when I started taking film classes in college. And Kurosawa, of course, famously cribs from American Westerns and a lot of his iconic films. So while Sergio Leone definitely takes an unauthorized take on Yojimbo itself is kind of pulling from a lot of famous Westerns, as are a lot of Akira Kurosawa's movies. And so I was definitely in that same kind of headspace back then. Saw Rashomon and just went down the Kurosawa rabbit hole. There's still plenty of his movies I haven't seen, but Yojimbo was definitely one of the most suggested ones from that early research, and Fistful of Dollars was too, in terms of Westerns. But like I mentioned, it's kind of strange because I had always found myself like I always teach Rashomon when we talk about innovative storytelling in my high school film studies class. I love teaching Throne of Blood because it's a Hamlet retelling. I love Seven Samurai because it's this incredible epic. So is Ron. But Yojimbo's never really been like one of my favorites. Yet it also has perhaps my favorite Kurosawa performance in it, with Toshiro Mifune, the so-called muse and constant collaborator with Kurosawa, especially during the 50s through the 60s and the early 70s before they had a epic falling out. And then Sergio Leone is also like one of those Western filmmakers that I never super keyed into. The one of his that I love a lot is Once Upon a Time in the West. I just never got into the Dollars trilogy. I like Good, Bad, and the Ugly, but this one in particular it just never really clicked for me. Clint Eastwood is in general never really clicked for me outside of Unforgiven, which has a lot more contextualization behind it, and then it's also like his masterpiece as a director. I don't know. So like it was interesting considering coming back here, but then also like looking at the other options of like what movies were remade in the 1960s. It's slim pickings in terms of like notable films throughout history, and we haven't done a Kurosawa, I don't think. So it kind of like was thinking, I got to give it another try. I know the Mifune performance is going to pull me through, but like one of the things I'm going to keep coming back to, I'm curious with your thoughts, since you're a big story guy, is like these these movies are kind of narrative messes. But
Yeah.
but I would love to dive into that. Now, these were both first watches for you, Dan?
Yeah, brand new. I've never seen Sergio Leone's anything he's done before. I've never seen Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Nothing. Yeah, totally. Yeah, and Kurosawa, who I always find it's so fascinating to me because when I think about like film studies and film history, I feel like Kurosawa and Western films are always part of that curriculum, right? It's
Right.
always like John Forrest, stuff like that. I've never taken a film class in my life, so it's like I never had any of that background of seeing a lot of Westerns or seeing a lot of the samurai movies. So yeah, brand new watches for me. Never seen a Sergio movie before, and then Kurosawa I've only seen was it Stray Dog and amazing noir. And so yeah, like my background here is pretty light. And I already kind of have a weird sort of chip on my shoulder about Westerns, which I don't know why I have that. I think I grew up with I didn't grow up with it. My dad didn't pass it down to me, but he grew up in the 1950s, so he saw like Rawhide and Bonanza. Those are shows that he watched and really liked. But I just for whatever reason, especially when I was a child, when Westerns would be on TV and stuff, I'd be like, I don't connect with it. And whatever Westerns came out when we were younger, I'm trying to think like what would have been a touch point for a lot of this. Unforgiven was a little bit early for us, I think.
Yeah.
Right, it was in the early 90s.
Tombstone.
I think
Anybody?
Tombstone would have been a big one.
Yeah.
Young Guns, remember Young
Young
Guns?
Guns.
Young
And
Guns is kind of a little bit
Young
like
Guns 2. And they're
It-
making a Young Guns 3 now. I don't even want to talk about it.
amazing. But yeah, it's probably Back to the Future 3 is really like our touch point to this whole thing, which is not a good movie. Like it's not a terrible movie, but it's certainly not good. Not even like the original Back to the Future. So I think for me, yeah, there's a lot of layers of like, I don't know, sort of mental detritus I have to get through to sort of like engage with these movies. But I will say this, Yojimbo, I think was a lot tougher for a watch for me than A Fistful of Dollars, just because, speaking to somebody who, grew up in America, all that kind of stuff, like in American culture, A Fistful of Dollars and Clint Eastwood has a much bigger stature in just cultural iconography than samurai films do. And anything like Yojimbo, which I'd never really heard of before, I think there's so much more for me to latch onto on a spaghetti Western, just because it's more pervasive. And yeah, they're both very interesting watches. And I was like kind of surprised at my reactions to both films. But before I get into that, we should probably talk about where these films come from, right? I think with Yojimbo, it's a pretty straightforward sort of story here, and you kind of touched on it, right? Essentially, kind of a mixture of noir fiction. I forget what was the book Red Harvest from 1929 is what Kurosawa sort of lightly based the basic story of Yojimbo on, and then throwing in some John Ford references and Western movies, and then kind of thinking about his own country's history and sort of the post-Edo period of Japan when samurais are losing their power and becoming sort of without like a master. So the Ronins, there's a whole sort of play on sort of societal chaos happening, which also then mirrors post-World War II Japan, which is when Kurosawa was obviously making his films. So I think with Yojimbo, there's, especially when you're looking at it at a historical context, there's a lot to bite into. what's interesting to me, and I would love to hear your reaction on this, reading all about that and thinking all about it and then watching it, I don't know that I picked up on a lot of that, going into it knowing that that's what this film is about.
Mm-hmm.
Right? A lot of the context, it didn't seem like it was actually that forward in the narrative, the acting, the cinematography. It did not bite down, or like when I bit down into the movie, it did not taste like I thought it was going to taste, which is going to be this like really robust, like layered, narrative about post World War II Japan, and like, the ambiguity of morality and postmodernism and stuff like that. I just didn't. I don't know. Did you get some of that juicy stuff when you watched this movie, or was it sort of? Did you have trouble with it?
Both. I got more out of it this time, I think, because when I had last watched it, I was much younger and didn't do a lot of the like deep dives that I've become accustomed to and to enjoying over the most recent years, especially with this show. So, I think in particular, like the layer about the setting was very unknown to me. Back in my first watch, circa late 2000s. And to be clear, it's like there's definitely that post-war element to much of Kurosawa's work. This one does have a interesting significance compared to his other works because it takes place in 1860, like right at the end of the Ronin samurai, as a concept before it essentially got dismantled with the new empire. So that's interesting to look at, especially with like that transition between swordsmanship and the introduction of the pistol. That was a little more obvious and fascinating to me this time around. But I think essentially your take's not wrong. It very much is. Especially in the pantheon of Kurosawa, it's a what you see is what you get kind of movie.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a big like kind of absurdist bungle of corruption and heroism, and that was perhaps the layer that I enjoyed the most, even more so than the historical context, was its mixing of tones. It's very. I think it's a lot sillier than perhaps a lot of people give it credit for, especially because it gets talked about in the same breath as Seven Samurai and Ron, two of his much more serious films. I think that what makes Mifune's performance stand out as the Ronin or wandering samurai that happens upon this small town, and it's basically torn apart by two warring factions, corrupt leaders, puppet government, and ultimately it like Mifune is able to communicate this sense of on the surface level. Perhaps like when I was younger, I read it more as hero comes in to like nobly like restore order to this lawless town. But now I read it much more as like aimless guy with little to no will to live enters town and basically tries to pit two people against each other, and turns out not to be not nearly about as effective as of a leader as the two corrupt leaders. It feels a lot more pessimistic in that way, watching it later in life. But I do ultimately think that even though there are those kind of big elements of thematic substance, it still kind of comes down to like, you got this cool set piece of the two factions getting set up against each other by Senjuro, Mifune's character. And you got the giant guy with the big hammer, and like that's like a really fun set piece to see him looking down from the tower. And then you've got like just this convoluted mess of back and forth with sake brewery and the silk merchant, and eventually most of the town is dead. Spoiler alert. So it feels very much like a half like wink kind of Western inspired. It's also, like you mentioned, the novel. It was both Red Harvest and then another novel called The Glass Key, which are both written by Dashiell Hammett, who's the author of The Maltese Falcon, who we're going to get into in the finale. And so then there's that whole element of like pulp fiction kind of in there, where it's like it is kind of supposed to be, just trashy entertainment value stuff, but elevated somewhat, because like Kurosawa is a master at staging scenes and cinematography, especially black and white cinematography. But there is still something that just like leaves me nagging at the end of it, because like, I mean, I'd be very interested if you go and watch Rashomon or Ron and don't have like a religious experience like I did, because I don't get that with Yojimbo. I get it with those movies.
No. Yeah. I mean, how would you, in reading through the reaction to this movie, and whether it be like critics or academics or people on Letterboxd, there's this notion that it is a parody and a comedy. Mm-hmm. How much do you buy into that this is not necessarily a serious film? There's some camp involved as well, but I don't understand enough about Japanese cinema, especially post World War II Japanese cinema, to really navigate those waters all that well. I mean, would you consider it a comedy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the biggest things that I took away this watch, and I think the biggest tell is perhaps like the inciting incident to make this guy realize that like, oh, this town is kind of fucked up. Maybe I'm gonna stay around, and it starts with the dog with the human hand in its mouth, right, running towards him. I also think that specific image has kind of become more, interestingly enough, humorous and referential over the years. Like I always, like if I see a dog running with a human whatever in its mouth, I'm immediately thinking about that One Tree Hill clip. You know what I'm talking about, with the dog running? Oh my gosh, this was
One Tree Hill.
Oh my gosh,
on the CW.
Yeah. Okay. You watched Taksu with Joel McHale?
Oh yeah, definitely. I love Taksu.
So it was like one of the first viral videos, I think, was this scene from One Tree Hill where someone is trying to get a heart transplant at a hospital, and then the person carrying the organ cooler trips and falls, and the heart falls on the floor, and then a dog that's in the hospital for some reason picks it up and runs away with it.
That just feels, interesting. And so this iconic clip is sort of has reverberated throughout history, huh?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's just one example, though. I think
that's how I came up with the movie. That was the initial thought process.
Oh, right. Yeah.
That's how he like conceived of the entire film, was a dog carrying his hand through the town to, illustrate that this town is lawless and there's no morality left. There's no one to sort of control things. I mean, I think the thing that I struggled with the most with the film is that layered genre situation. Because we mentioned this kind of in the notes, you talk about noir, and noir is the maybe foundation and initial conception of the film. Then you have sort of, I guess you call them samurai films. I think there's a more technical term for it. On top of that, and then you have westerns on top of that, and then you have this sort of comedy parody layer on top of that. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's the hard part for me. It's like one of those club sandwiches that is so high, and when you try and eat it, like you like almost like dislocate your jaw. It kind of felt like that for me. Like even just like removing the complexity of the plot, which is incredibly all over the place. To me, it was. And the number of characters is overwhelming.
It's very difficult. I was constantly going back and forth between the cast list on Wikipedia.
What is going on? But I think that to me, it's like that that genre mishmash, which obviously Kurosawa is a master filmmaker, but it is very, very hard to pull off. It's way easier to stick to a very specific vibe and tone and really just hit on that over and over and over again, which is what I think A Fistful of Dollars does. and does really well. Whereas Yojimbo, it's trying to do so much, and it was very successful. People loved it. It was very popular in Japan. And so there's something here that really attracted people and engaged people at that time back in the early 60s. But I think for me, it just feels like it's a little bit all over the place, and it's too much to kind of digest maybe in a single watch. Now I could defend that and basically like, oh, you got to go rewatch it. But this was like a huge hit. Like this is like a huge, big movie, almost like a blockbuster. So I don't know, like where do you? So it's a comedy, right? I think that's pretty clear, in a parody of sort of previous Japanese films about this period pieces. What about this noir notion, right? Like, do you find that's noir-y? I actually don't find it very noir-y at all.
Yeah, and that's interesting coming from somebody that only has watched Stray Dog, which is like his most noir movie.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think the part that stood out for me this time, like I kind of alluded to, is not only like the how much the comedic aspect hit more on second watch, but also like the nihilism.
It is cynical.
It is so cynical.
Yeah.
And I think that's such a hallmark of noir that combined with its source material, I was thinking about this as I was doing the rewatch of like, oh yeah, I feel like you could pretty easily translate this to, seedy neighborhood of San Francisco, and there's like two crime bosses, right, that have taken over, and then Sam Spade or whatever walks in and tries to find a way to pit them against each other. It is there. The skeleton is very clear. In terms of like aesthetic, though, I think you're right. It doesn't nearly, like, there's so much depth of field here. There's so little use of like expressionism, because it's clear that Kurosawa wants to put it all like on the battlefield, like make everything very much more like a Western. And in some ways, Western and noir have DNA, like common DNA in their storytelling, but they are almost complete opposites when it comes to aesthetic and style, right?
Yeah.
The landscape versus the closed doors, the big open expanses versus the dimly lit alleys. So I do think that that's part that gets lost a little bit, but I also think we're in this weird time of movie history right now where it feels like genre, and I don't know, we haven't talked about this in a while in this show, and it used to be our bread and butter, Dan, so help me out here.
What's that?
I feel like so much of genre film has kind of become diffuse in recent years.
Okay.
And so I think watching this in 2025 hits a lot different than if you're watching it and have the historical context in even like 20 years ago. I don't know. The one movie that came to mind as an example while I was watching, because I had just recently seen it, was The Shining. I was teaching The Shining. We watched it in my film class. We were also watching Mission Impossible just before that, the original De Palma, and talking about how like in the 80s and 90s, like genre was king. And it was just very clear that even though like The Shining's this huge allegory for alcoholism, and even though Mission Impossible is very much like a popcorn flick that also like capitalized on this guy's master of suspense techniques, you had a spy thriller and you had a horror movie. And nowadays my students pointed out that like there's that new movie Novocaine that came out with Jack Quaid, and and like a few kids in my class had seen it, and they're like, was it an action movie, was it a comedy, I don't know, it like didn't feel like Rush Hour, it didn't feel like a buddy film, It just felt like everything just feels like it's like all maximalist. It's like putting all the genres in a blender.
Yeah.
And so
Well,
that's, I
yeah.
don't know. What are your thoughts on
I mean,
that, especially with regard to
that has
Yojimbo?
been sort of like the artistic era probably since 2010. It's like,
Yeah.
and that we first saw it in music, where music became very genreless very quickly as streaming took off. And I think with film, as film production has shifted from these traditional exhibition studios playing in movie theaters, over to streaming. Streaming film is much bigger than movie theater business now. And I was just thinking about this the other day. Like Netflix puts out 140 original films a year.
What? That's just the
Yeah,
films, not the series?
that's just the films. That's
Oh,
enough that would like match all major studio movies in a year or something like that. It's around that amount. It's like 3 movies every weekend. So yeah, I think there's definitely an element where we've been flooded with content and a lot of different types of films coming at us. Oddly enough, though, I feel like genre has become very entrenched and people are not aware of genre as they were before. Where we're just seeing stuff on Netflix. It's like, whatever, it's just a movie. I'm going to toss it on. There was one that came out, Carry On. Did you see this?
Oh
Netflix
yeah,
original?
the
Yeah,
Die Hard 2 ripoff. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. It's like, you're sitting there, you click play to that movie and you're like, I know this is an action movie. And I know that it's supposed to follow certain sort of genre, sort of signpost or buoys along the journey. And it does that, but it doesn't have the sort of grandiosity of, say, Die Hard 2, which is a very good, fun action movie. So I think that like there's this weird sort of notion where it's almost like we've lost the identifiers of genre because
Yeah.
of this sort of flood of content. And I think the thing about your Jimbo, I think that's actually a really good point. If I was going to see this in an art house theater in the 90s, in the 1990s, I would have a completely different experience than I do now.
Yeah.
Because I would come to it with all of this sort of like, I guess you call them like paratext, like things outside of the movie that would enhance the experience. Maybe I found out about it from a guy at like a cool video store that I visited, right? And there's that sort of layer of social connection to the film. And then it's like, oh, I saw this other samurai movie like a week ago, and that was a really fun experience with friends. All of that has sort of not just like gone away, but it's changed so dramatically that, and I was thinking a lot about that with A Fistful of Dollars and how that was released and how we see it now. But yeah, I think you're really onto something, that like the way that we are consuming or viewing films now is so different than it was before, let's say pre-streaming, that it is very hard to sort of see these films for what they were historically.
Yeah.
Right. Because people who are seeing this in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, probably have a very, very different experience with it, which is why I was looking at Letterboxd on this thing. This has a 4.3 on
Yeah.
Letterboxd. I'm just like, I was watching, I think, a video of it on YouTube, and someone in the YouTube comments is like, this is my favorite film of all time, period. Nothing comes close. And like, it's YouTube comments, so like whatever, take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
But for someone to say that, there's something here that I am clearly missing. Like, I am not getting what other people are getting with this movie. Like, if I had to letterbox this thing out of 5, I would say maybe like a 3.2. Like, it's just, to me, there's not nearly enough meat on the bones to give this a high artistic merit status. Like, it's just not there. Now, maybe that's my background and not having the right context to approach the film, but like, that's kind of where I'm coming from. But yeah, I think there's something to that, where it's like, if I'm seeing this movie 20, 30 years ago, it's a completely different ballgame, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I do think like it's one of those letterbox phenomenons, I feel, where I don't know, I would be interested to look up all the Kurosawa movies. Like there's
I did.
so,
Yeah, I looked at most of them. This is like number 4
okay.
on this list, or 4 or 5.
Yeah. Which seems to be on par with the general consensus online, but there is a certain cachet, of course, to these kinds of classic films that maybe you'd like to think these are the people that are being very thoughtful and intellectual, but they're a group that is just as prone to groupthink as any other, right?
100%. Like art, like film nerds and snobs, we do
Yeah.
tend to like group certain films at a high status.
Yeah. It's interesting though. It feels perhaps a little serendipitous that our guest on this episode fell through, which is my bad, by the way. I forgot to solidify the invite, because I do feel like this is one of those movies where it's like there's so many classics where we could talk for hours about how special they are and how impactful they are, and it's just unfortunate that this isn't one of them. And I'm saying this as somebody who like has two, but kind of three, but like definitely two Kurosawa movies that are just like I love them, and I think they're hugely important in the history of cinema. But I have to agree with you. There's
Yeah.
all the stuff that's happening here, and this is, I think that's also an interesting production note. This might have been the seed of Kurosawa and Mifune's relationship souring over the years, is because a lot of what is happening with Sanjuro, the protagonist, is what Mifune is doing on set, like improvising in the moment, because the script is so scattered and focused on the back and forth between the factions of the town. And it is one of those unique, I don't know, what were your thoughts on his performance? Because I do think
iconic. It's iconic. Like you watch him in like the first moments you see him, he owns the entire movie.
Oh yeah.
The problem is he's not in the entire movie. Right? Like it's not. It's centered. The story is sort of centered. It's not even centered on him. It's centered on this conflict.
Yeah,
and all these people going. And he's kind of like this character that's swimming in those waters, but it doesn't. The camera doesn't feel attached to him. I don't feel like I'm seeing his perspective. So he's not a traditional protagonist by any stretch of the imagination. But like when he is on screen, it's all the little things that he's doing are fantastic. And they're really amazing to say. Like it's so clearly that he owns this role and understands what he's doing more than anybody else on that set.
Right. It's also like Kurosawa in 64 or 61, he's very much in his prime. Like he's being prolific and he's just delivering, and he's experimenting from film to film. And it is kind of interesting that of all the movies, this is definitely still one of the most regarded, because even New York Times, when it came stateside a year later, called it out, and Bosley Crowther wrote, however, as in most Westerns, the dramatic penetration is not deep and the plot complications are many and hard to follow in Japanese. Kurosawa is here showing more virtuosity than strength, which I think is a nice way to kind of sum up what it tends to happen with especially those auteur filmmakers throughout all eras of movie making, is they definitely fall victim to this idea of bigger is better and more is better. And so this is very much like too far, but for some people that's what they want, and I think that it stands out in that way. So whatever whatever floats your boat, Letterboxd people. It's also important. Yeah, we gotta know, but maybe this could be the segue. It's also important to say that Mifune's performance is what inspired John Belushi's samurai character in Saturday Night Live, right? And so that got me thinking about Fistful of Dollars. And here's perhaps where we can actually get a little discourse going. We might disagree, because I actually think Fistful of Dollars is not as successful as Yojimbo is.
Oh, totally disagree. Couldn't disagree more.
So go into it, because I think part of what makes Yojimbo so special is that comedic factor, and that like Belushi saw that in Mifune's performance. And Fistful of Dollars, I I get nothing from it. It feels
Oh my
flat from start
god!
to finish.
Really? So, I mean, Fistful of Dollars to me is sort of, it's funny. I came into that one too. Like, I before I watch these movies, I always look at YouTube and see what people say about them. I love doing that. I love for my perspective to be colored by other people before I even see a movie. It helps me understand. I don't know. It helps me engage with the movie a lot better. And I remember seeing Quentin Tarantino go on about this movie and how this is the perfect trilogy. It's the only trilogy that actually works. I'm like, God, he's so full of it. But after watching this, I'm like, oh, I had no idea anything about spaghetti westerns. I had no interest in them really at all, and I had no idea why they were held in such high esteem by film nerds, filmmakers, and that sort of stuff. After seeing this, it's like, oh, I 100% get why this is beloved. There's the things that stick out to me are Sergio Leone's never been to the United States when he makes this movie. He doesn't speak English, right? So he's making a Western about a country he does not necessarily understand all that well. Although he was into Old West history and stuff like that, but it is such a snow globe-ish imagined world here. Obviously not shot in America or in Arizona or Texas, shot in Spain. And I think the fact that there is this massive distance between him and actual Westerns, and also how this movie was made. Comparing to Yojimbo is a studio movie, right? Now it's post World War II Japan. It's not Hollywood, but it's a studio film. It's shot on a lot, all that kind of stuff. A Fistful of Dollars feels very gonzo to me. In the way that it was made and the way that it was conceived. I think they wrote it very quickly. They shot it pretty fast. Clint Eastwood goes on about how there's no real trailers, didn't have electricity. They're shooting on film and doing sound later. It's just a very bizarre film when you dive into the guts of it. But there's something I think that clicks for me in sort of the means of how this thing was produced that makes it sort of spark in a way that normal Westerns never have for me, ever. And of course, the music. The music's phenomenal. There's something about it to just sort of, there's this, it's like the glean off the spurs in their boots. There's something there that just it does something here that I think a normal Western has never done for me before. Because I think what it really comes down to is the Western genre, when you think about in American culture, was so well formalized by the time that we were kids and by the time this movie's even being made, that the conventions are set in stone. And the leeway within those conventions is not very big. But then you get this guy coming along, in Italy, just from total left field, making a Western, and he's able to use those genres, the genre conventions that he sort of knows, and create this whole brand new world. I don't know. There's something there that really excites me and it works for me. And now I've got to go see the other two movies. I have to.
Yeah, I'd be interested because I haven't seen them either. And I want, like I said, Once Upon a Time in the West, I love that film. I think that's Leone operating on all cylinders, and he has figured stuff out. But on the other hand, I'm also known to be somebody that is very much drawn to an auteur's debut film, because it's them at their most raw and unfiltered, and it's, they're trying everything out on screen. It is youthful and exuberant, but like I said, I think a lot of it has to do with Clint. This feels so. This feels
good.
like heresy.
And I don't like him.
Say.
I don't like him at all. I hate him as a director for the most part. I hate him as an actor.
I don't like. I'm just I got so bored with him. I remember actually. So I didn't see this movie for the first time until maybe 2011 or so, and the first time I watched it, I remember turning it off, just being I cannot figure out what's going on. What's similar with the convolution of Yojimbo, It's a little less convoluted here, but it still very much is like. And I remember in particular the moment I turned it off is like when they try to set up the corpses as,
The graveyard.
at the graveyard.
Classic.
I couldn't buy it, and I turned it off in frustration.
Well, it's so
Try-
schlocky. It's a
Right.
schlocky movie. The whole movie's schlock.
Okay, so why?
Okay, this is it. And this is something I was thinking about this in the shower the other day. So this goes back to Quentin Tarantino, who I hate that I keep bringing up on this podcast, but I can't help it. You know, and it made me actually think about like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood a little bit as well. There is something about someone who understands. We always talk about this like B movies, and like we talked about this like Dawn of the Dead. That's a B movie, and Night I Lived Out is a B movie. Within that playground of exploitation, grindhouse, B, whatever you want to call it, it does allow for this freedom of expression that you cannot do through the studio system. It does not work. And every once in a while, 99% of the time, that's a disaster, right? The movie's terrible. It's like a sci-fi original. It's awful. Every so often you get somebody like Sergio who comes along, who has a vision, who has an artistic sort of drive to do something bigger and better. You know, had pedigree, you know, being a production assistant and working as an assistant director, then a director in the film industry. You know, it's like these elements just come together, and the only reason they're allowed to come together is the B movie gonzo world of filmmaking. And to me, this is one of those movies where it shouldn't have worked. Right? There's no way this movie should work. You know, like the fact that Sergio doesn't speak English and Clint Eastwood doesn't speak Italian, so they have to go through the stunt coordinator to figure out what the hell's going on, even with basic language stuff. You know, there's in that lack of rules, which I'm such a big rules person too, which is bizarre. In that lack of rules and organization and sort of maybe bureaucracy, but it's really just comes down to convention, right? Without those conventions in place and those guardrails, it really can be something amazing and cool and interesting and new. And I think that's what A Fistful of Dollars is to me. But like I said, 99% of the time in those situations without those conventions and rules, things fall apart.
Yeah.
It doesn't work at all. But I think for here, it works wonderfully.
So sell me on this whole gonzo aspect, because like I'm a huge Peckinpah fan. There's so many elements of gonzo filmmaking that appeals to me greatly, as we've talked about with Cronenberg movies before.
Yeah.
But this one, like I think the lead performance is so inscrutable and basic, and I also find the action, you know, with the exception of, you know, our Back to the Future 2 reference, the final scene with the,
of course, yeah,
with the steel plate, pretty great. And you know, I don't know. I think what feels special to me in a Western with regard to like stylistic violence and like using it as kind of a lever for pulling the curtain behind on American society in today's world, and how it's not that different from the lawless West. I'm not seeing here in as like crisp and impactful of a way as perhaps I had already kind of become enamored with in the Western genre, with like stuff from John Ford, where it's not the gonzo, but it's definitely got the commentary. But then you look at Peckinpah and the Wild Bunch, and it's like you've got both the commentary and the excess. Where's like what's a good example of the gonzo filmmaking here?
I give the perfect example. When the Rojas brothers go to massacre the Baxter family, right? Like that entire sequence is insane. It is absolutely nuts in the sense of how he shot it. The bodies were left, these are stuntmen, left on fire. Did you notice how long they were on fire?
Huh.
They just sat there for like 10 seconds on fire, not moving. The close-ups of the Rojas brothers as they're murdering people, like these extreme close-ups where it basically becomes a horror movie.
Hmm.
And you're like, this makes no sense. This is not something they do in Westerns. I know enough about that to know they don't do that in Westerns. And then you have this moment where, you know, the sheriff, who's like the lead Baxter dude, he comes out with the husband guy, and they're like, oh, we give up. And then Ramon shoots them. And then the wife comes out crying, oh, you murder. And then he just wastes her, right? Like, it's nothing.
Yeah, that's
like,
true.
That's nuts. Like, in 1964, that's insane. I know enough about context that like there's something bizarre about all of this. And that's what I mean when I go back to that schlocky element. Schlock allows you, and the same way I think about John Waters, it allows you to do and say things you cannot normally do, but under the guise of schlock in B movie. But the actual content of what you're saying is still there, right? So like he's showing these, you know, it's kind of, there's a little racism going on here too. Why are the Mexican guys so vicious and horrific and evil? You know, you look at their face, they enjoy killing people, right? I don't know, there's something that it when the filmmaker and everybody involved steps outside those boundaries, it really can go a lot of different ways. Here, I think it works because it's just so over the top. And the music is 100% a part of this. It is like maximalist and gonzo in these specific directions that say something. I don't know that they say anything profound or like good about people, but it is a very strong artistic statement at the very least. And I don't know, I love I think Eastwood's amazing in this.
Sell me on this. What is he doing other than being blank faced?
Yeah, but that's just it. Like I think so let's go back to like Yojimbo, where you know, that character is floating into this town, but he throws up a stick and it says go this direction, it goes that direction. Okay, great. He's, you know, flowing with the wind, but he's, you know, he's more, there's like there's an ironic detachment to him, right, in his behavior and how he acts with these sort of roaring people. And that's a little bit there with Eastwood, but I think there's a layer of like American sort of machismo that he inhabits. This idea that I'm above it all, but I'm also a part of it. Whereas the detachment in Yojimbo with Sanjuro is so cynical and detached that he's not a part of it at all, right? Where it's like it feels like Joe
until the end.
Well, yeah, until the end. But I just feel like Eastwood's performance is like it feels groundbreaking to me because it is.
They just picked a cheap guy off of the cast of Rawhide. I don't know.
Well, you're not wrong. You're not wrong, but that doesn't change what he does on screen, right? When like it's funny because Eastwood, I think, early in his career was criticized for this. He was criticized for being, he doesn't really know what he's doing. He's kind of an amateur.
Yeah.
He doesn't emote enough.
He's
like
sleepwalking
through these things. And like, I think for whatever reason, it was the exact palette that Leone really needed here for this movie. Because then it becomes this, because when you think about, go back to the novel, the noir novel, go back to Yojimbo, and this idea of a lone hero walking into a town to sort of step in and right a massive wrong, but it's almost like a universal wrong, like a very big, broad idea of wrongness. And their idea of rightness is not this sort of like, you know, quote unquote moral rightness. It's sort of rebalancing the world in a way. They're not like setting things right; they're just rebalancing things. Eastman, to me, and his character here, or Clint Eastwood, sorry, you know, I think he, in his flatness, becomes like the paradigm of what an anti-hero really is. This is like the idea of anti-hero is what Eastwood does in A Fistful of Dollars, where it is someone who does have a moral code. He clearly has a moral code, but it's his code. And he steps in exactly when he wants to step in, and he leaves other things, and he plays people off of each other. He's a backstabber. You know, he's not, by any stretch of the imagination, a good, quote unquote, good person, but he has a moral code. I don't know. It just feels to me like a real great example of what if we ever wanted to define an anti-hero, like he would define it.
And maybe that's, I feel like that's it. Obviously, the word anti-hero has gotten tons of baggage over the years, right?
It does, especially recently.
Yeah, especially recently. And I think that that's probably part of my own baggage with this movie, perhaps, and just Clint Eastwood in general over the years, which I think that's where we do agree, is like, whether or not you agree he's sleepwalking here, he sleepwalks through the majority of his career, right?
Yeah. I mean, I would say up through, I don't know, maybe Unforgiven or something. He does
Space Cowboys, maybe, I don't know.
Space Cowboys. I mean, Dirty Harry is not the worst movie in the world.
No, yeah, I mean, and I do like a fair amount of Eastwood performances and a fair amount of his directing work, but this kind of also comes back to another common kind of discussion on this show, which is the idea of like the value in a workman-like aesthetic, right?
Totally, yeah.
That's part of the appeal too, I'd imagine. And going back also to like the schlockiness is like, they're churning it out because that's what they are meant to do. And the whole spaghetti western subgenre relies on that kind of, off the cuff, almost absurdly asymmetrical viewpoint on the idea of American manifest destiny and all that, which is interesting because like we're here talking about two movies that are essentially highly influenced by Westerns and American Hollywood filmmaking, and neither were made in Hollywood, right?
No, yeah. I mean, they're interpretations, right?
Yes,
of that world.
Yeah. I don't know. I maybe I'm also kind of just having a moment of revelation where it's like maybe I don't like Westerns as much as I initially let on.
Maybe I love Westerns.
Yeah, there you go. Oh my gosh. Are you ready for some trivia, Dan?
Let's do it. Yeah, trivia.
Okay. Changed up the format here a little bit, since I mentioned at the top of the show, there's so few movies that were remade in the 1960s that have kind of a high profile. So rather than give you a list of random movies that neither of us have seen or maybe even heard of, I went with the route of English language remakes of Japanese films.
Nice. I love this. This is a good idea.
You've got a collage in front of you of 12 different movies that are English language remakes of Japanese source material.
Gotcha.
And you have to guess which movie I am referencing when I read an excerpt from a review that came out at the time of the remakes release. Are you ready?
Go for it.
I'm going to lob you a softball because it's one of the best quotes I've ever read in a movie review, and it's from the almighty Roger Ebert. Chicago Sun-Times. He said, "A big, ugly, ungainly device to give teenagers the impression they are seeing a movie."
Big, ugly. The Ring?
Nope. Don't overthink it. Big, ugly.
Godzilla?
There you go.
Oh, okay. I was going to guess Godzilla, but I thought it was too obvious.
No. That's
how terrible is that remake?
Oh,
God. It's unwatchable. Even today, it's unwatchable.
I know. Just give me the first half hour of the Bryan Cranston, and nothing else.
No, the entire Bryan Cranston one's
No, the first half hour.
It's so good. I live in the last
hour. Aaron
hour.
Taylor Johnson is not.
He's not a star, but he can't help it.
All right, number 2. Let's go with this one. There are no icebergs here, but that doesn't prevent the movie from sinking under its own weight. That's from CNN.
The Guardian.
Nope.
Sinking under its own weight. Dark water. Oh,
Nope.
iceberg. Should I know that there's an iceberg involved?
No, it's a reference to one of the most famous films of all time. One of the
Titanic.
Yeah. And so, which one had Cameron involved?
Oh, James Cameron was involved in which one of these movies? Alita?
Yeah.
Oh.
Alita Battle Angel.
When did that come out?
I don't know. It was like a few years ago.
Or something? Okay.
Yeah, Robert Rodriguez directed, James Cameron produced.
I do remember this. Yeah.
You must have talked about it on your Wildline box office podcast.
I remember talking about it. I was like, what a disaster.
Yeah, the big eyes. Oh my gosh. All right, number 3. And I can't believe I had this on the collage and I didn't even mention it earlier. Talking about Kurosawa movies, this is also, so yeah, I definitely have a solid 3, possibly 4 Kurosawa movies I would absolutely recommend. This one was remade, and here's a quote from The Hollywood Reporter. At the end, I felt not like I'd seen an old favorite in a new light, but like I might want to go back and watch the original again. There are worse outcomes for a remake than reviving affection for the original or retelling an old story for a new audience that may not have heard it before. There are better ones too.
Magnificent Seven?
Nope. I misled you. I tricked you.
What'd you do?
Which another one of these is based on a Kurosawa movie?
Oh my god. What is based on? Living?
Yeah, nice.
Is it based on what is it?
Ikaru.
Ikaru, yeah, okay.
Yeah. Fantastic film. One of his only like straight dramas. And we've heard this story before, but here's where it originated in 1953 with a tale about a guy who finds out that he's dying of cancer. It's terminal. He has weeks to live. Here's how he spends his last days. And it was remade a couple years ago with Bill Nighy in the lead role. He was nominated for an Oscar for it. I haven't seen it. I'm sure it's fine.
Yeah. Bill Hader loves the original, so.
Nice. Yeah.
Awesome out there.
Did you see that in the Criterion Closet?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Nice. Okay, number 4. Where is it? Oh, from the Village Voice. Requiring an enormous amount of suspended disbelief, the original may be a culture-specific phenom, despite strenuous efforts to Americanize. The preview audience I saw it with did a lot of cackling.
The Grudge?
No.
The Ring?
There you go. There you go. Yeah.
Really? Because I saw this in 2002 when it came out.
Yeah.
And, my theater was on pins and needles.
That's so bizarre. Because I had a much more similar experience to the reviewer.
Oh, really? You're in Minnesota, right? You're in Minneapolis?
I actually saw it when in Chicago.
Midwesterners are so cynical.
I know.
In North Carolina, we were all like terrified.
Oh no, a videotape.
What is this? Japan.
Okay. No, I don't. I've never.
I've rewatched it like 3 or 4 times in the last 4 years. It is a masterpiece. Gore Verbinski is a genius. I'm going to reclaim this movie single-handedly and make sure it's a masterpiece. Get it on Criterion now. Let's go.
No thanks. Number 5. This is from New York Magazine. It has the trappings of a classic and hits its marks. All of this director's movies hit their marks, even sadistic formula junk. But there's no grandeur in its images or generosity in its soul. I don't think the director ever loved this genre, and by the time this movie ended, I'd forgotten why I do.
Dark Water?
Nope.
The Grudge?
Nope. Last chance.
Shall We Dance?
No, that's Magnificent Seven.
Oh, okay.
Talking about Antoine Fuqua and The Equalizer, trying to turn that into a Kurosawa remake. Even Ethan Hawke can't save it. Too bad.
Yeah, too bad. All right, we got one last episode in this season.
The finale.
Maltese Falcons from 1941, and then the original from 1931. The closest thing out. Any closing thoughts, Chris?
I feel like we're winding down with a whimper, but
Yeah.
I'm hoping that we can come back strong, because I think the Maltese Malkin. What am I talking about? The Maltese Falcon is one of the movies I've seen the most out of all the
Oh,
Film Trace movies.
really? I actually don't like it. So,
Okay, we're
so
going to
that's
the
just,
mat. We're
we're
gonna go
gonna
out with
go.
a bang.
We're gonna go. It's gonna be fisticuffs on the last episode of
Absolutely.
Film Trace. Thanks for listening. This, of course, has been Film Trace.